Hello, and thank you for joining me tonight. Let your breathing slow just a little. Release the tension from your shoulders. Let go of the lingering sounds of the day. And come with me into a story that rests at the boundary between curiosity, wonder, and fate. Tonight, we will not only speak of ships crossing the ocean, nor only of old maps or familiar names from history books. We will follow something far more fragile than that. The moment when two worlds first laid eyes on one another. Try to imagine the surface of the sea still veiled by a thin morning mist, light as breath. Out on the horizon, strange sails appear slowly, like shapes that do not belong to this place. On the shore, eyes are fixed on the water, silent, watchful, curious. None of them could possibly know that a meeting which seemed so brief would soon set in motion changes vast enough to shake an entire continent. For the first encounters in America were never simply about one people stepping into the presence of another. They were the moment when unfamiliar languages touched, when different beliefs looked upon one another, when gestures of kindness could be misunderstood, and when small gifts could become the first signs of immense transformation still to come. Tonight, we will move slowly through those first beaches, those waterside villages, those cities that left outsiders astonished, and those lands where curiosity gradually gave way to fear, dependence, violence, and resistance. If you enjoy history told like a long dream, gentle, deep, and immersive, please take a moment to like the video. And as you listen, you can also leave a comment telling me where you are listening with me tonight. And now, let the night close softly around the room. And together, let us begin the journey back to those first encounters that changed America forever. Before the first white sails appeared on the horizon, before unfamiliar names were written into the sailors' journals, before church bells, iron, disease, and ambition from across the ocean found their way to the sandy shores of the Americas. This continent had already been waking into its own countless mornings for a very long time. It woke in the thin mist over the river's surface, in the warm scent of cooking smoke rising from long wooden houses, in the soft sound of footsteps on earth, still damp with the breath of night, in the gentle slap of water against dugout canoes at quiet riverbanks, in the laughter of children, the calls of adults, the beginning of work, the familiar and enduring sounds of a life continuing as it always had, from one season to the next, from one generation to another. If we stand very still tonight and allow our imagination to slow, we may begin to see an America very different from the simple image so many older stories once told. Not a vast emptiness waiting to be discovered, not a silent land waiting for someone to name it, but a continent already inhabited, already crossed by paths, already filled with memory, already carrying history, a broad world of different communities, speaking different languages, remembering different ancestors, living among different landscapes, yet all bound deeply to the land in ways that outsiders, at a passing glance, could very easily fail to see. In the far north, where cold winds skimmed across waters the color of lead and ice held earth and sky in a long silence, indigenous communities had learned to live with the cold not as an enemy, but as a rhythm that had to be understood. They knew which ice could be crossed, which waters should be avoided, which seasons were meant for hunting, which for storing away provisions, which sky foretold strong winds, and which stillness in the snow meant prey was somewhere very near. Life there was not loud, not theatrical, but it was never poor. It was subtle, precise, wise, and handed down through the eye, the hand, and the memory of something longer than a single human life. Farther south, the forests grew thicker, the rivers broader, the birds more numerous, and the turning of the seasons began to shape life differently, in regions blessed with fertile soil and abundant water. Villages were not merely places of shelter, but the centers of a way of living tested and refined over time. People farmed, fished, hunted, dried food, stored it for winter, repaired roofs before the rains, told stories when the fire burned high, and held ceremonies when the moment came to give thanks to earth and sky. Every task of daily life was tied to a very old understanding that human beings do not live apart from the land, the water, the plants, the animals, and the ancestors, but in the midst of all of them, receiving from them, and at the same time bearing responsibility for keeping the great cycle in motion. Perhaps one of the easiest things to overlook when we look at the Americas before contact is their fullness. Not fullness in the sense that every place was alike, or that every community lived in the same way. Not at all. It was difference itself that was so immense. In some places, there were coastal villagers whose days were bound to the tides, to fish, to shellfish, to canoes, and to sea winds. In other places, there were forest peoples who knew every trail through the trees, knew which medicines could stop bleeding, which bark could be woven, in which season seeds would fall, in which season deer would pass. There were plains and valleys where agriculture shaped the rhythm of the entire year, where seeds were not only food, but also the continuation of family and community. There were indigenous cities so large that when Europeans later saw them, they were stunned into realizing that what stood before them was not the edge of the world, but a civilization. But in this first chapter, we do not yet need to go as far as those moments of astonishment. We need only remain with a quieter, deeper truth that this continent already had its own breath before outsiders arrived. Try to imagine a morning in a riverside village. The mist still hangs low over the water. The houses still hold a trace of night's darkness. A woman steps outside, places her feet on the cold ground, and looks up at the sky to read the weather. Elsewhere, a child is being taught how to tie a cord, how to carry a basket, how to read fresh footprints in the mud, not far away. A man sits mending a fishing net with hands long familiar with the work since childhood. Inside the house, perhaps an elder is beginning to tell an old story, not to pass the time, but to keep memory alive. That story may speak of ancestors, of a migration many seasons ago, of how high this river once rose, of why a certain animal is held in reverence, of what must be remembered when entering the forest, of how to live rightly within the community in such a world. Knowledge does not live only in words. It lives in habit, in ceremony, in the way a hand is guided, in where a boat is placed, in knowing when silence is called for, in the order of who speaks first in a gathering, in how food is shared on important occasions. There were societies that outsiders, at a glance, might mistake for simple, because they did not raise stone walls like Europe, did not write in the same script, did not arrange life according to forms familiar to the world across the ocean. But that simplicity was many times only an illusion in the eyes of those who did not understand what they were looking at. Behind a cultivated field stood knowledge accumulated through many seasons of failure and success. Behind a trail stood generations of footsteps. Behind a hunt stood experience in the movement of animals, in wind, in patience, in coordination. Behind a ceremony stood an entire world view in which human beings did not stand above nature as masters, but within it as one part that had to learn how to live rightly. And across the continent, life did not stand still. Goods were exchanged, news was carried, ideas moved with people and along waterways. A shell from the sea might travel far inland through many hands. A beautiful stone, a fine hide, a craft technique, a story, a song, a marriage tie, an alliance, a grievance. All of these could travel farther than we might imagine. The Americas before Europeans arrived were not countless islands of people living in complete isolation from one another. They were a connected world. Though its forms of connection did not resemble the ones Europeans would later record on their maps. Maps, sometimes, are also a way of making the world appear different from what it is. A blank sheet of paper can easily make a land seem empty. A blank space on a European map did not mean that no one lived there. It only meant that the mapmaker had not yet learned how to see them. And perhaps that was one of the earliest, quietest tragedies of the encounters that would come later. Worlds that had long existed in fullness were viewed by newcomers as though they had only begun to exist once someone else had named them. Yet if we set the map aside and return to the ground, to the water, to ordinary life, we see the opposite. We see lands that had been tended. Forests were not always wild in the sense of untouched. Grasslands were not always natural in the sense that human beings stood outside them. Many indigenous communities knew how to burn with care, how to plant selectively, how to harvest at the right moment, how to keep the sources of life in balance without turning the land into something wholly subject to human pressure. That knowledge was not loud. It did not call itself science in the modern sense. But it was knowledge, memory, and long observation carried so far that it had become part of culture itself. In villages, in longhouses, in clustered settlements around plazas, by lake shores, beneath mountains, along the coast, family life too had its own orders and arrangements. In some places, the mother's kin stood at the center. In others, authority was distributed according to the community's own traditions. In some, decisions were reached only after many voices had been heard. In others, the standing of elders was carefully preserved because they carried memory and law. In others, still, storytellers, healers, guides, and guardians of ceremony each held a part that the community could not do without. That world was not perfect. Of course not. No society is perfect. There was conflict, competition, warfare, poor harvests, and grief. But that is precisely what made it more real. It was a human world, rich, complex, alive, not a dim backdrop waiting for someone else to step into it as the main character. And perhaps, if we move very slowly through this first chapter, what matters most is not any single name, but the sense of time's depth, Before strangers from the east found the shores of the Americas, children here had already grown old beneath the sky of their own world. Families had survived winters, buried loved ones, celebrated harvests, built new homes, moved villages, kept promises, made enemies, and made peace. Prayers had been spoken in languages Europeans would never understand. Songs had been sung beside the fire through generation after generation. Roads had been formed without anyone from across the ocean arriving to tell them where to go. We are often drawn into history by moments so large that everything before them seems only a prelude. But for the people living in that time, before the ships appeared, no one imagined they were living in the opening scene of someone else's story. They were simply living their own lives, and that is what makes what came later so profound. Because when we speak of the first encounter, we should not imagine a new world beginning to face an old one. No. These were two worlds, both already ancient, both already full of memory, both already carrying their own beliefs about the order of life, suddenly seeing one another on some shoreline, before the great event was written down in ink and on paper. There had already been indigenous people looking out to sea as they always had. Perhaps they were watching the weather. Perhaps they were waiting for canoes to return. Perhaps they were thinking of mending nets, of the next meal, of tomorrow's path. The water was still the familiar water. The wind was still the familiar wind. Birds still crossed the sky as they had on other days. And then, one day, something different appeared far away. At first, perhaps only a strange speck, then a sail, then many sails. But just before that moment, this continent was already itself, already full of people, already full of memory. So before we move onward into the first encounters, the first glances, the first gifts, the misunderstandings, the fragile agreements, and the growing tragedies that followed, we must hold firmly to this truth. America did not begin when Europeans saw it. Its history did not open when it was named in an outsider's tongue. It had already existed for a very long time in the rhythm of paddles through water, in the season when corn rose from the earth, in the snow gathered along the northern coasts, in footsteps along the trails, in the smoke of evening fires, in stories retold before sleep. And now, as the night of this first chapter gently closes around us, what remains is perhaps not only the image of a vast continent, but the feeling of a world whose life had already run deep before others came to call it new. A world that was not silent, only speaking in other languages, not empty, only not yet seen rightly by outsiders, not waiting, but living. And it is precisely from that ground, full of people, full of memory, full of its own orders, that the first encounters to come draw their full meaning. For only when we understand that this place had already lived completely before, can we begin to understand how much a single sail on the horizon could change. This chapter begins at the edge of the cold wind, where the northern sea often carries a silvery gray color like metal, and the horizon is not always clearly drawn. On some mornings in that land, the light arrives very slowly. It does not burst forth, but gradually unfolds, Low strips of land lie still along the water's edge. Grass bends with the wind. Dark peat pools hold on to the dampness of the night. Beyond them is water, cold, wide, and seemingly unwilling to reveal anything. Try to imagine someone standing on the shore on such an early morning. That person is not standing there waiting for history. They are simply living their life beside a familiar sea. Perhaps they are watching the weather. Perhaps they are waiting for a hunting companion to return. Perhaps they are studying the water just as their ancestors did through countless generations, in a place where day and night, mist and wind, seabirds and currents determine so much. Looking out toward the horizon is not a romantic gesture. It is part of survival. And then, one day, a shape appears where there ought to have been only cloud and water. At first, perhaps it is only something slightly unusual, a strange line, a shadow a little darker than the sea. But the longer one looks, the clearer it becomes that it resembles nothing familiar in those waters. Not a rocky island, not the back of a whale breaking the surface, not the canoe of people one has known before. It is taller, sharper. It carries a form that seems to belong partly to wood and partly to wind. And when it draws nearer still, the person on the shore may begin to understand that it is something made by human hands, but not by the people of this place. That is how this story opens, not with the declaration that the first Europeans had arrived, but with the moment a northern shore caught sight of a distant and unfamiliar form. Today, at the northern tip of Newfoundland, at Lens aux Meadows, archaeology has shown that this place preserves the remains of a Norse settlement from the 11th century, with turf-covered timber structures similar to those built in Greenland and Iceland. UNESCO describes it as the earliest known evidence of European presence in North America, while research published in Nature has dated the Norse presence there to the year 1021 at the same time. Parks Canada emphasizes that this land had been used by indigenous communities for around 6,000 years before that, and that archaeology at the site has identified traces of several different groups, including the Dorset people, who had camped on the south side of the bay more than 2 centuries before the Norse arrived. That makes this scene far deeper than it might first appear, because when we speak of the first shape on the horizon, we are not speaking of the moment history began. We are speaking of the moment one very old world discovered another unfamiliar world that had also crossed the sea long enough to arrive here. A touching of edges between 2 ways of life that were never formed to understand one another. That land was not gentle in the sense of being easy to inhabit, but it was legible to those who knew how to read it. The wind from the Strait of Belle Isle could cut through the body like a thin blade. The ground was soft and wet in many places. The peat held water, held cold, even held footprints if someone stepped too heavily. The coastline did not always open itself easily to boats against that backdrop. The Norse set foot in a place that must have felt both familiar and strange. Familiar, because they too came from northern worlds where wood, stone, grass, ice, and sea had taught human beings to live with steadiness and patience. Strange, because this was not Greenland, not Iceland, not home. This was a new edge of land, where everything had to be tested again by eye, by hand, by time, We can picture them dragging their boats ashore in the hard wind, planks creaking, ropes dark with seawater, dark cloaks snapping against their legs. They speak to one another in a language no one on this shore could understand. They step across the low grass, look around, measure the land with the instincts of people long used to living at the edge of maps. They do not build a city at once. They cannot. And perhaps they never intended to. What archaeology reveals at L'Anse aux Meadows is a small encampment of 8 structures, including living quarters, a smithy, and workspaces, stretched along a narrow strip of land overlooking a peat bog and a small brook near Epaves Bay. The traces found there point to ironworking, woodworking, and most likely a base from which they explored regions farther to the south. Seen through the eyes of a night story, the place becomes almost cinematic, not the cinema of crowded squares or banners filling the sky, but the cinema of concentration. A few low-roofed houses, grass-backed, almost as if they wished to sink into the earth to resist the wind. Thin smoke slipping from a vent. Inside, the warmth of people, the warmth of fire, the scent of wood, damp wool, hot metal from the smithy, someone repairing a rivet, someone scraping down a plank, someone staring out toward the sea. Perhaps from homesickness, perhaps from caution. In a place like that, every iron bar, every piece of timber, every hot meal is not a small thing. They are what allow human beings to cling to a far edge of the world. But it would be a mistake to imagine this land as empty when they arrived, long before those turf-roofed structures appeared. This had already been a place to which indigenous peoples returned again and again across different stretches of time. Perhaps because of its rich marine resources and its closeness to Labrador, which means that in the deep memory of the land, the paths leading here did not run only in one direction from the Eastern Ocean. They were also the long-established routes of indigenous communities, people who understood seasonal winds, fish runs, hunting shores, and the right times to arrive and depart. What was new here was not the presence of human beings. What was new was the appearance of a different kind of people, bringing different boats, different houses, different iron, different language, and perhaps a different idea altogether of why one would come so far from home. I think it is precisely here, in the stillness before the first greeting, that this chapter carries its greatest weight, because we do not truly know exactly how the first face-to-face meeting in this region unfolded. Archaeology gives us foundations, materials, structures, dates. Old Norse texts give us memories retold later. In sagas written down centuries after the events. But between those two remains a veil of mist. And at times, that mist suits a bedtime story better than certainty ever could. We do not need to force history to speak louder than it knows how. We need only sit beside it and listen to the part of it that is both clear and blurred. The Vinland sagas tell us that the Norse did not simply sight new land and turn away. They moved on through places called Helluland and Markland, then into Vinland, and at some point encountered indigenous communities whom they called Skraelings. Britannica notes that the sagas differ in detail, but they all describe short periods of trade that quickly gave way to clashes, after which the Norse withdrew. It also suggests that Lonso Meadows was most likely a base used for exploration farther south, rather than a large and enduring colony. So perhaps we should imagine that encounter not as a scene in which two groups walk out into a field and introduce themselves, but as a chain of cautious observations. Perhaps first there were only strange footprints, a piece of wood carved in an unfamiliar way, a fresh cut in a tree trunk, a line of smoke rising where none had risen before, and from the Norse side, something similar. They surely did not enter this region in complete blindness. They must have realized quickly that this was not some abandoned edge of the world. This land had people who knew it. These waters belonged to people who understood them, and that meant any presence of their own would have to live beneath the gaze of others. It is easy, from the distance of 1,000 years, to turn this moment into a symbol. But if we lower our voices, we can see how human it really was. One group exhausted after a long sea journey. Another group wary before floating objects they had never seen. One side may have been curious about hides, small boats, people, language, and tools belonging to the other. The other side as well. In first moments like these, no one was necessarily thinking in grand words like conquest or history. They may have been thinking in far more immediate terms. Who are they? What do they want? Are they dangerous? How long will they stay? What can be exchanged? Do they understand the signs being offered? And if there truly were brief exchanges before unease began to rise, as the saga tradition suggests, then this must have been one of the most fragile scenes in the whole story of the Americas. Try to picture the two sides standing far enough apart to feel safe. The wind moving between them, no one speaking the other's language, an object offered first, a gesture of the hand, a small step backward, a searching glance trying to read intention. In later chapters of this journey, we will see other encounters grow larger, harsher, more turbulent. But here, in the cold and distant north, everything is still in its earliest form, an experiment to see whether two worlds can exist close to one another at all. And then, as history tells us, it did not last. We do not know every detail, but archaeological evidence and later written sources point toward the same broad truth. The Norse did not transform this place into a long-lasting settler society. Their presence was brief, perhaps very brief. The article in Nature speaks of a very short-lived settlement. Britannica also stresses the great distance from Greenland, the population that was too small, and the fact that they were not alone on this new land as major obstacles. Put simply, this place was too far, too difficult, and already home to other people who were more numerous, more familiar with the land, and more deeply rooted in it. That is a very important detail to remember, because in so many later stories, history is told as though the moment Europeans touched the shores of the Americas, the outcome had already been written. But that was not always so. Here, in this early encounter, those who came from across the ocean did not immediately open the way to domination. They came, built a camp, made repairs, worked iron, probed southward, perhaps met, perhaps exchanged, perhaps collided, and then departed, the first shape on the horizon, in this case, did not become a flood pouring across the continent. It was more like a warning or a foretelling. The first crack in the long separation of two worlds. Perhaps on some afternoon, when the wind fell and the light slanted across the grass. Those turf-roofed houses were still standing whole. Someone sat outside, mending leather. Someone tested the edge of an axe. Someone watched clouds gathering in from the sea, far off, perhaps. Other eyes were watching them too from a distance just far enough to remain unseen. Both sides understood the same thing, even if they had no shared words for it. This place was not merely land. It was a living region. It was food. It was a route. It was memory. And because of that, no one was present here innocently. Night falls faster in the northern lands than one expects. As the light fades, the sky may hold a silver line over the water for a very long time, while the earth itself grows visibly colder. In a low, grass-covered house, the Norse may have sat around the fire, telling one another of what they had seen along this shore of the ocean, somewhere beyond their sight. Indigenous people may also have been telling of the strange boats, the strange people, the strange sounds that had appeared at the edge of the sea. I have always thought that this is an image both beautiful and sad at once. Two groups of people telling stories about one another in the night, with no bridge strong enough for those stories to truly meet. And so, Chapter 2 is the chapter of a first shape appearing on the horizon, carrying equal measures of wonder and unease. It is the chapter of a small outpost at the end of the wind, of low houses clinging to the earth, of a faintly glowing forge in wet grassland, of distant observations, of very brief chances to understand one another, and of the truth that this contact did not become a shared world on its own. When we look back at Lens aux Meadows today, with its excavated foundations, its artifacts, its patches of turf, its reconstructed buildings that help later generations imagine what once stood there, what remains is not only proof that the Norse came here. What remains is also a quieter lesson. The first encounter between America and Europe did not begin with a great army, or with certain maps, or with a clear awareness that both sides were entering one another's history. It began in a place very far away, very cold, and very fragile, with a strange form on the sea, a few small houses raised at the edge of the grass, and a feeling that both sides must at some point have carried in their hearts, that the world had just become a little larger and a little more dangerous. From that moment on, and so, as this chapter closes, we may keep in our imagination one final image, a Newfoundland shore in the late afternoon light, wind passing through the low grass, cold gray water, very far away, perhaps a boat growing smaller on the horizon, or perhaps only the trace of it left in the memory of those who once saw it. America was still itself in that moment, but from that time forward, it knew that beyond the sea there were other people, other ships, other ambitions. That first shape came, and then it passed. But because it had once appeared, the horizon would never again be entirely innocent as it had been before. Now, let the northern winds of the previous chapter fall behind us, and come with me down into warmer waters, where the Caribbean opens in a gentler blue, brighter and more shimmering, where the light of early morning is no longer sharp as steel, but soft as a thin veil of silk spread across the sea. If in the north the first encounter emerged among low grass, peat bogs, and cold wind, here it arrives with sunlight, with mild waves, pale sand, dense green foliage, and a sense of peace so deep that it is hard to believe history could change direction in a place so beautiful. On the final night before land was sighted, aboard those ships from across the Atlantic, there were likely men nearly worn down by waiting. They had traveled too long between water and sky, too long with the same horizon, too long with a hope slowly eroded by day after day without shore. The ship's wood was soaked with salt. The ropes had grown stiff and dry. Human skin had darkened under the sun, then chilled again at night. And somewhere amid that exhaustion, one thought still clung to them like a nail driven into planks of wood, that there had to be land ahead. There had to be something beyond the water, not only because they needed it, but because without it, the whole voyage would become an irreparable mistake. Columbus had left Spain in search of a sea route to Asia, and until the end of his life, he still believed that the lands he encountered in the West were part of Asia. Then, on a morning in October 1492, the thing they had been waiting for at last appeared, but from the shore on the other side. That morning did not begin as a discovery. It began as so many other mornings had begun on the islands of the Caribbean. Some people had risen early. Some stepped out from their resting places, set their feet on cool ground, listened to birdsong, to wind passing through leaves, to the steady sound of waves beyond the shore. Some may have been preparing to fish, others tending to food, others speaking in the familiar rhythm of community life. Because before the strange sails appeared, this island was not some strip of land standing in wait. It already belonged to a Taino world with its own society, beliefs, political life, and communal structure. The Library of Congress describes the Taino as the largest indigenous population in the Caribbean at the time of Columbus, with complex religious, political, and social systems. They were skilled farmers and seafarers, and they also composed music, poetry, and created powerful expressive objects. When we speak of the day two worlds saw each other, perhaps the most important thing is to hold both gazes within the same frame. From the sea, those aboard the ship saw a green and radiant island rising after a long succession of days with nothing but water. From the shore, the Taino may have seen tall, unfamiliar forms upon the sea, utterly unlike the boats they knew from island life. They did not glide low over the water like canoes. They rose above the sea with great wooden bodies and white sails, at once like something made by human hands, and yet as strange as some creature never seen before. If you allow your imagination to move very slowly, you can see that the moment was not loud at all. There was no gunfire yet, no army rushing onto the shore, no grand words about empire or conquest being spoken aloud. There was only observation, the sea between them, two sides looking at one another, each knowing they were seeing something that had never existed before in their memory. It was one of the most fragile moments in all the history of the Americas. because if we look from the distance of centuries, we know that day was later placed into books as a great turning point. But for the real human being standing on that shore, history did not yet bear the shape we would later give it. A Taino person looking out over the water may simply have been wondering who those strangers were. Where had they come from? What did they want? Would they stay? A Spanish sailor, seeing people on the shore, may have been thinking not of the fate of a continent, but of something far more immediate, that at last he had escaped the fear of dying adrift in infinity, that here there were people, fresh water, food, and some answer to a part of the journey. Columbus recorded that when he arrived at the Bahamian island, the Taino called Guanahani in 1492, he encountered the Taino there. The Library of Congress confirms that this was the meeting on the island of Guanahani, while Britannica notes that many scholars identify it with present-day San Salvador in the Bahamas, though the precise location of Guanahani remains debated. The naming itself was already a sign that two worlds were looking at the same place in different ways. For the Taino, it was Guanahani, a name that belonged to the land, to memory, to a world already present from before. For Columbus, it became San Salvador, in a single act of naming. We can already feel two very different understandings of what was unfolding. One side stood within its own world. The other had begun to draw that world into its own system of meaning. And all of this happened almost at once with the first footsteps on the sand. Imagine that morning on the shore. The water is bright. Small waves slide forward and then retreat, leaving behind a thin, wet line on the sand. The vegetation beyond the beach is dense and alive. Birds move through the leaves. Perhaps bodies stand in clusters, not too close, not too far. Watching the small boats leaving the great ships and moving toward land. From those little boats, the European men saw the local people, and they did not see them with an empty gaze. They saw them through everything they had brought with them from the old world: ambition, religious faith, habits of observation, curiosity, and the confidence of men who believed they were entering the outer edge of Asia. Columbus reported this voyage to the Spanish crown, describing how he saw many islands filled with countless people and claimed them in the name of the monarchs of Spain. But from the perspective of the Taino, things could not possibly have been understood in that same way. The Taino were not a people without history, stepping out from the trees to wait for a stranger to define them. They were part of the Arawak world, living across the Greater Antilles, including Cuba, Jamaica, Hispaniola, and Puerto Rico, with their own spiritual life, in which the Library of Congress mentions deities such as Yukahu and Atabe. They cultivated the land, traveled by sea, organized communities, created, played Batu, and left a linguistic imprint across the Caribbean that still survives to this day. The Smithsonian also emphasizes that many Arawak place names and words remain present, and that contemporary Taino communities are still reviving their language and traditions. So when the strangers appeared, the Taino were not standing at the edge of a simple world. They were standing at the center of their own. And that is what makes this scene both beautiful and piercing, because both sides may well have looked at one another with genuine curiosity. The newcomers saw bodies, objects, gestures, language, hair, ornaments, forms of presence unlike anything familiar in their own world. The Taino may also have seen thick clothing, great wooden ships, metal, flags, crosses, flashes of steel, lighter skin, strange beards, and unfamiliar ways of standing, pointing, and calling to one another. History sometimes likes to tell of the encounter as though it were simply one line of people approaching another, but in truth, such a meeting is made from countless smaller details. Who stepped forward first? Who stepped back? Who offered what object first? Who smiled? Who kept silent? Who looked too long? Who pointed in which direction? I think it is precisely that fragility which gives this chapter its own cinematic quality. Not the cinema of pounding drums or rapid cuts, but the cinema of light, distance, and faces, a raised arm, an object handed over, a foot touching unfamiliar sand, a voice speaking words the other cannot understand, a moment in which both sides try to make sense of one another with the very little they have in hand. Great historical encounters are often imagined as loud events, but it is entirely possible that the first thing between them was instead a long silence. Columbus described the Taino in his letters through the eyes of an outside observer, and printed editions of those letters quickly made him famous across Europe. The Library of Congress notes that the earliest illustrated editions of Columbus's voyage relied largely on imagined images, even borrowing from Mediterranean scenes, which means that, from the very beginning, Europe had already started to see the New World through representations that were not entirely true to reality. That, too, is a very important layer of this chapter. The two worlds did not merely see one another. They also began misunderstanding one another from the very first glance. Columbus believed he had arrived at the edge of Asia. Those in Europe who later read his letters received them through frames of imagination already familiar to them. But for the Taino, the people stepping onto the beach that morning could not simply be understood according to the map of some unknown continent beyond the sea. We do not possess a Taino diary recording their exact thoughts that morning. And it is precisely that absence which means this story must be told more carefully, more slowly. We should not replace their voice with false certainty. We can only stand near that moment and say this: there must have been observation. There must have been curiosity. There must have been a swift chain of guesses built in the mind. And there must have been things that both sides thought they understood when, in truth, they understood almost nothing at all. Perhaps that is the deepest feeling of Chapter 3. Not victory, not discovery, but the appearance of something for which no shared language yet existed. If you move even more slowly through that scene, you can see the sand brightening beneath the early sun, the small boats scraping against the shore, men stepping down from the ships, slightly unsteady after so many weeks at sea, salt water touching their ankles, before them, people watching in silence, or with sounds they had never heard before. Somewhere, perhaps, the first objects were exchanged. Somewhere, perhaps, hands pointed inland, or toward the ships, or upward, or toward the earth. Every gesture was small, but not small at all, because where there is no common language, gesture becomes the first bridge. And like every fragile bridge, it can lead two sides nearer, or it can set the foot down in the wrong place. What makes the meeting at Guanahani so special is not only its fame, It is the brief transparency of a moment before the full consequences had revealed themselves. Here, everything still rests inside the first light. We have not yet stepped into the larger machinery that would come afterward. We have not yet gone from island to island, into coerced labor, into colonial systems, into sickness spreading along sea routes. All of that belongs to later chapters. Here, we are standing exactly at the threshold, where what appears before the eyes of both sides can still be read as strange, intriguing, perhaps even harmless. And that is why it is sad. Because we, who came later, know that the calm of that beach was not the whole story. We know that the thin brightness of that morning would not last for long. We know that those first glances did more than simply see one another. They also opened new roads for ambition, for naming, for possession, for the widening movement of people, goods, animals, crops, disease, and power. The Smithsonian describes the changes following the conquest of the Caribbean as something that transformed the world, expanding contact among Europe, the Americas, Africa, and Asia, and making the Caribbean a launching point for later conquests and settlements in other parts of the Americas. But tonight, we do not yet step into that great current. We remain with a single day, a day when two worlds saw one another, a day when names overlapped upon the same island, a day when weary seafarers thought they had reached the edge of Asia, while the Taino stood upon the land of their ancestors and saw a kind of people they had never seen before. A day when the invisible maps inside each mind began to collide. A day that seemed so bright, so beautiful, so peaceful, yet already carried within it the seeds of upheavals no one on that beach could possibly understand in full. And perhaps that is the most beautiful and truest way to remember Guanahani. Not as a stage where a hero stepped forward to open the new world, but as a shore where two histories met without fully understanding one another. One side carried flags, faith, longing, and geographical illusion. The other carried island memory, community, language, ceremony, and the ordinariness of a morning that had once belonged to them like so many mornings before. Both stood beneath one sky. Both listened to the waves. Both looked, and from that act of looking, the world began to change. As this chapter closes, keep that final image in your mind. The waters of the Caribbean are still bright. On the shore are fresh footprints, those of the people who have just stepped down from the ships, and those of the people who have lived here for a very long time. Those footprints lie side by side for only a brief moment, before history pulls them in different directions. And perhaps there is no image more fitting for the day two worlds saw each other than this. Not shouted cries, not flags in the wind, but the first footsteps on a beach where neither side yet knew that they had just stepped into one another's story. After the day when two worlds first saw one another, what came next was not always open confrontation. Before tension took on a form that could no longer be concealed, before power entered the land through harsher means, there was often a softer phase, a slower one, and one far more difficult to read. It was the phase of arms extended in caution, of objects set down upon the ground and gently pushed forward. of eyes trying to guess what that object might mean, of smiles that were not yet trust, but not yet refusal either. If the previous chapter was the moment when two worlds first saw one another, then this chapter is the moment when they began trying to speak to one another with almost no shared language except objects, gestures, distance, and ritual in first encounters like these. A gift was never merely a gift. It could be a greeting. It could be a test. It could be an invitation to exchange. It could be a promise of temporary peace. But it could also be understood as a sign of acceptance, of entering into a certain order, or of an obligation to respond in a way the other side had never intended. It is precisely here that everything becomes fragile, for the same object, placed between two different worlds, will carry two different layers of meaning: a string of glass beads, an iron blade, a piece of cloth, a hat, an animal, a meal, a hand pointing toward a riverbank, or a young person walking with an envoy as a sign of goodwill. All of these could become language. And like every early language, it was full of the possibility of misunderstanding. In the Caribbean, after the first encounters, records of Columbus's first voyage show that he used gifts and words of reassurance as a way of establishing goodwill and calm in his early contact with the Taino. Yet even in those very records, the giving of gifts was bound up with observation, judgment, and probing, which means it was never simply friendliness from the very beginning. Gifts stood between two intentions at once: contact and inspection, greeting and measurement. Try to imagine a sunlit beach where two groups stand only a few paces apart, the sea still glittering behind them. One person offers a small, shining object in his hand. The person on the other side takes it, looks at it closely, touches it, passes it to someone else to examine. No one can speak the other's language, and yet everyone understands that what has just been handed across is not merely a thing, it is a message. The trouble is that neither side is certain what that message means. One side may think we come with good intentions. The other may understand these people are asking to enter into a relationship of exchange. Or perhaps the one offering the gift is thinking something deeper still. Whoever receives this object may already have taken one step into the order I am bringing with me. A small gesture, and yet it can already be filled with 3 or 4 different meanings at once. In the north of the continent, among the French entering the Gulf of St. Lawrence, we see something similar. In 1534, at Chaleur Bay, Jacques Cartier's expedition met a group of Micmac and exchanged iron goods for furs. On the surface, this may seem like a very simple and practical exchange, the kind almost anyone could understand. This for that. But only a short while later, during that same journey, Cartier arrived at Gaspé, raised a large cross to claim the land for the King of France, and then forced the 2 sons of Chief Donnacona to leave with him for France. Here, we can see with particular clarity how fragile those first gestures truly were. One exchange may create the sense that both sides are successfully negotiating with one another. Yet another sign, such as raising a cross or carrying people away, reveals that a completely different layer of meaning is already at work beneath the surface. What makes moments like these so haunting is that they stand precisely at the boundary between communication and symbolic possession. The Mi'kmaq may have seen exchange as part of contact between communities that came to know one another through mutual interest and caution. From Cartier's side, however, the exchange of goods may have been only a small part of a much larger movement, in which land would be called by a different name, marked by different symbols, and drawn into a system of power far beyond the understanding of the people standing upon that very ground. One journey, the same hands passing objects between them, yet two entirely different logics already existed side by side. One side was thinking in terms of relationship. The other had already begun to think in terms of sovereignty. And perhaps nowhere does this difference in meaning appear more clearly than in Chesapeake, where the English and the world of Wahunsunakak, the man English records called Powhatan, had to learn to read one another through objects, meals, seating arrangements, delegations, and even the things left unspoken. From the earliest years, Powhatan sent gifts of food to help the English, who were hungry at Jamestown. Pocahontas often came with those journeys as a sign of peace. In those early encounters, Powhatan offered to receive John Smith as a son, extending goodwill and land to the English on the condition that they respected his leadership and answered with tribute in the way he understood it. If we set all grand language aside, that story becomes profoundly human. Imagine a community hungry, living amid an unfamiliar marshland and illness, dependent on maize and food from people they still did not fully understand. From Powhatan's point of view, sending food did not necessarily mean yielding or placing himself in a weaker position within his political order. It may have been a gesture that placed strangers within a relationship structured by rank, obligation, and reciprocity. From the English side, however, those gifts of food could easily be read as temporary assistance, a short-lived concession, or even proof that they had somehow made a favorable impression. No one stepped into that moment with an empty mind. Everyone carried their own understanding of what a gift meant, what a greeting meant, what it meant to answer or return one. And there were moments when everything seemed, for a while, to touch some small point of balance. In one meeting in 1608, the English brought Powhatan clothing, a hat, and a greyhound, and it was by all appearances a rather smooth encounter. We can linger over that scene for a long time. A strange hat, an unfamiliar fabric, a swift and beautiful animal that the other side might gaze upon with curiosity. In such moments, history seems to soften. Human beings can see one another through delight, through novelty, through the feeling that perhaps the other side, too, knows how to value beauty, usefulness, and the worth of something chosen as a gift. But that softness rarely lasted, because the true issue did not lie in the gift standing alone. It lay in the system of meanings that accompanied it. A cloak may be a gift, but it may also be a sign that the giver wishes to place the receiver into a certain role. A meal may be hospitality, but it may also carry the expectation of loyalty in return, or at least respect for the host's order. A young person accompanying an envoy may serve as a pledge of goodwill, yet the other side may see only a likable figure. Without understanding the full significance of the ritual, every divergence begins in such small ways. The highest point of misunderstanding in Chesapeake came in a ceremony the English imagined as grand, while Powhatan saw its true nature immediately. The London Company decided to stage a coronation for Powhatan, sending many gifts and a crown from King James I. The English intention was both to recognize Powhatan's leadership over his own people and to turn it into a symbol of acknowledging the English king's authority. But Powhatan refused to come to Jamestown to receive the gifts, forcing the English to bring everything to him. Once they arrived, the ceremony faltered further because the English wanted him to kneel in order to receive the crown, while Powhatan understood very well that kneeling meant lowering himself before another power, and so he refused, in the end. The English had to try to compel him to follow the form of their ritual so that they could place the crown upon his head. And Powhatan answered by giving them an old pair of shoes and a cloak. It is a deeply memorable scene, because it mirrors the essence of this chapter exactly: one ritual, yet two entirely different understandings layered over the same moment. The English believed they were raising an indigenous leader into the symbolic system of English kingship. Powhatan, by contrast, turned the entire ceremony into a display of who truly held standing on that land. A crown was presented as a sign of authority from one side, yet received and neutralized by a different logic from the other. And that answer, an old pair of shoes and a cloak, if we look at it long enough, feels almost like a response without words. I understand your game, but I will not enter it in the way you intend. It is here that we begin to see the true nature of those first encounters. It was not merely that human beings lacked interpreters. It was that two symbolic orders were colliding. Europeans often carried with them rituals bound to sovereignty, divine right, dynastic honor, and ownership. Many indigenous communities, by contrast, placed greater weight upon relationship, standing within networks of alliance, reciprocal obligation, the honor of the host, and balance among all parties within a particular space. When these two systems touched, a single gesture could become extraordinarily fragile. Raising a cross might, for the French, be a valid declaration, but to those standing on that land, it did not become reality by itself. Sending food might, for Powhatan, mean placing strangers within a relationship that had to be respected. Yet the English either would not or could not accept that system of meaning all the way through. Offering gifts in order to open peace could be sincere on the human level, but on the level of empire, it could also be the first step in measuring how the other side might eventually be drawn in. And yet, if we tell this chapter only as a history of calculation, we will miss its most delicate truth. For within all those misunderstandings, there were still deeply human moments. There were times when someone genuinely liked the gift they had received. Times when both sides sincerely wished to avoid a rupture. Meals, days of exchange, stretches of silence spent sitting near one another, in which curiosity may well have been stronger than fear. Later, history is often stained by its ending, and so we forget that there was once a moment when nothing had yet locked into place. No one yet knew for certain which direction events would take. That is why the first gifts, the first signs, the first steps into one another's rituals, always carry a very particular sadness. They are like slender bridges raised across an abyss, capable of bringing people closer, yet just as capable of breaking, because each side imagines the bridge leads somewhere different. If tonight we sit very still beside an imagined shoreline or beside an imagined fire, perhaps we will understand Chapter 4 in this way. Before history speaks loudly through open confrontation, it often whispers first through symbols: a hat, a string of beads, a meal of maize, a greyhound, a cross, a crown, a young girl walking with a group as a sign of goodwill, an old pair of shoes given back in reply. Each of these things, standing alone, is very small. But once placed between two worlds trying to read one another, they become the first sentences spoken. And like many first sentences, they both open the possibility of closeness and reveal that the two sides may, in truth, be listening with entirely different ears. And so this chapter does not close with a great shock, but with a faint sense of misalignment, slight, yet no longer easy to repair. An object is given, but its meaning does not travel with it in the way the giver intended. A ritual is arranged, yet no one enters it with the same belief. A greeting is extended, yet the other side receives it as an entirely different kind of request. And perhaps that is the true foundation of so many later tragedies. History does not always begin with open hatred. Sometimes it begins with two worlds trying to be decent to one another, trying to read one another, trying to place a hand upon the fragile bridge between them, without realizing that beneath their feet, meanings had already begun slipping apart from the very beginning. There is something very strange about the first encounters between worlds. Both sides often imagine that history is driven forward by great ships, by leaders, by empires, by those who step out first with flags, with crowns, with declarations and ambition. But if we look more closely, more slowly, we begin to see that between the two shores of that history, there are always other people. People who are rarely allowed into the first light, yet who are the true bridge that allows the encounter to continue. They are the ones who can hear two languages, or at least understand two different kinds of silence. They are the ones taken away, then returning with voices no longer quite the same. They are the ones who survive long enough to learn how to read the eyes of both sides. They are the ones who no longer belong wholly to either world, because history itself has placed them in between. And perhaps, in this entire story, no one is lonelier than they are, because the in-between is rarely a place people choose willingly. It is not stable ground. It is not a home. It is like a narrow sandbar between two currents, where the person standing there must constantly keep their balance, must constantly guess how the words they speak to one side will be heard differently by the other, and then return to bear that distortion within themselves. A translation is not merely the carrying of sound from one language into another. In first encounters, it is also the carrying of worldviews, rituals, honor, fear, power, and intention. And sometimes, only the slightest shift is enough to tilt history itself. Let us begin in the southeast, where Hernando de Soto's expedition landed in 1539 with about 600 men, 300 horses, pigs, mules, hunting dogs, and a great deal of equipment, yet no guide or interpreter for the land they were entering. The National Park Service makes it clear that De Soto had no interpreters or guides, and that very soon he found a Spaniard living among an indigenous community. That man was Juan Ortiz, who had once belonged to the Narvaez expedition of 1528, had been taken captive, spared through the intervention of a chief's daughter, and then lived for many years among indigenous communities before becoming De Soto's bridge of language. Try to imagine Juan Ortiz at the moment he was found. Perhaps he no longer looked entirely like the man who had left Spain years earlier. The Florida sun had altered the color of his skin. Many rainy seasons, many hot seasons. Many nights spent sleeping among sounds that at first had been strange must by then have become familiar. Indigenous words must have entered his mouth long before he realized they had begun to change the way he thought. A man like that, when he saw his old countrymen appear with steel, with horses, and with the intention of conquest, could not have felt only relief at being found. Perhaps he also felt something more deeply unsettling, that the world he had learned to live within was now being forced open again by the very people who had come from the place he once called home. We often speak of interpreting as though it were simply a profession, but for those caught in between, it is almost always fate. Juan Ortiz did not merely translate roads, names of people, names of villages, food needs, or places to rest for the night. He also had to translate the atmosphere of an encounter, to translate the caution of indigenous people for a group that was far too confident, and to translate the urgency of De Soto's company for communities that had no reason at all to trust such visitors. Every time one side frowned, every time a request was made, every time a gesture was misunderstood, the person in the middle had to be the first to feel the cold of that misalignment pass through him. In one sense, people like Ortiz carried a burden almost impossible to bear, for if the encounter remained calm, very few remembered them. But if the encounter unraveled, they were the first to understand why it had done so, and they were often the ones left with nowhere truly safe to retreat. From Florida, let us move a little farther north, to the St. Lawrence River, where another kind of person in between begins to appear. During Jacques Cartier's voyages, the two sons of Chief Donnacona, Domagaya and Taignoagny, were forced to leave with Cartier after the meeting at Gaspé in 1534. Parks Canada records that they were taken aboard Cartier's ship and continued with him for the remainder of the expedition. Canada also notes that this act set a deeply troubling precedent when Cartier carried Donnacona's two sons back to France. If tonight we sit still enough to think of them as real human beings, rather than merely names in a record, we begin to feel the sadness of this chapter deepen by another layer. They were not only taken away from their land, they were also turned into vessels of knowledge between two worlds. When they returned, they did not return as the same people they had once been. They carried with them memories of ships, of long seas, of France, of different sounds, different rooms, different people, and from that moment onward, they became people both sides needed, not out of kindness, but because they knew what the other side did not. Canada also records a detail both beautiful and fragile. The word Canada most likely came from the word Kanata, meaning village or settlement. And it was these two young indigenous men who showed Cartier the way to the Kanata, called Stadacona, later. Cartier used the word not only for the village itself, but for a far broader region. It is a moment worth pausing over. A small word, spoken in the simple context of giving directions, goes farther than anyone who spoke it could have imagined. One side may simply have been helping a stranger understand a place in the most practical sense. The other lifted that word out of its original setting, placed it upon a map, made it larger, and altered its destiny. And at the center of that movement stood people like Domagaya and Tegnoagni, who were at once guides, witnesses to change, and reminders that sometimes even the name of a nation passes through the mouth of those whom history has held in between. According to an official Canadian source, Domagaya later also helped Cartier's crew survive the harsh winter of 1535 to 1536 through knowledge related to the treatment of scurvy. That detail alone is enough to show that those trapped in between did not merely carry language. They carried life itself. They were the place through which a foreign expedition learned how not to perish in a land it did not yet understand. And yet perhaps the most powerful image in this chapter still lies in central Mexico, where a woman named Malintzin entered history not as one who held a sword, but as one who held words. A Library of Congress publication on the meeting between Moctezuma and Cortés emphasizes that Cortés relied upon the difficult intercultural translation of the woman interpreter Malintzin when recounting Moctezuma's greeting. And it also notes that Cortés selected the elements most favorable to himself, turning a courteous welcome into something that seemed like an acknowledgement of Spanish authority. Here, the in-between is no longer merely a place of entrapment. It becomes a place through which power passes. Try to see Malintzin not as the contested symbol she later became, but as a human being standing in a room where every gaze carries weight. On one side are the Spaniards, looking to her to hear what they want to hear, or what they need to hear. On the other are the Mexica, speaking through their own language, courtesy, hierarchy, and layered meanings. And she stands between them, knowing that every word carries consequence, that the softening or sharpening of a sentence, the choice of one word over another, can alter the entire rhythm of the encounter. In the hands of interpreters like her, language is never transparent. It is always slightly clouded by power, by circumstance, by fear, and by survival. That is why I think this chapter must be told very slowly, because those in the middle do not merely connect two sides like emotionless bridges. They absorb the pressure of both worlds. They hear the pride of empire and the caution of indigenous communities, and must place both into a single sentence without letting that sentence break apart. They know when a smile is genuine and when it is only surface. They recognize what is being hidden inside a greeting. And perhaps the most painful truth is this: sometimes they are the only person in the room who truly understands that neither side is actually understanding the other. Seen this way, those caught in between are the saddest figures in the entire journey, because they live within a kind of division that cannot heal. When they are with Europeans, They understand the indigenous world too deeply ever to remain fully innocent when they are with indigenous communities. They understand Europeans too deeply ever to believe that gifts, promises, or gestures are always harmless. They know too much to be at peace, and still know too little to save themselves completely. And that is also why history so often treats them with a particular cruelty, either through forgetfulness or through names that are far too simple: traitor, collaborator, loyal one, servant, guide, interpreter. But such names are always much smaller than the true price they paid. For many of them did not stand in the middle through free choice. They stood there because they were taken away, held back, forced to learn how to survive, or simply because history dragged them across a boundary from which they could no longer return as the people they once were. Their lives did not move cleanly from point A to point B. They were torn apart, stitched back together, and then made to continue in a new shape. If tonight we imagine all three scenes at once, Chapter 5 will appear like a sorrowful band of light stretching across the continent. In Florida, there is Juan Ortiz, who lived long enough among indigenous communities to become the key of language for an expedition that did not know what kind of world it was entering. In the Saint, Lawrence, there are Domagaya and Taignoagni, taken away and then returned, carrying words, memory, and a path between worlds. In Mexico, there is Malintzin, standing in the middle of words too heavy to bear, where a single translation might become part of an empire itself. But what makes them alike is not merely their role as intermediaries. What makes them alike is that they show us that first encounters never took place simply between Europeans and indigenous people, as though these were two solid blocks facing one another. Between those two blocks, there were always real human beings, flesh and bone, carrying memory, fear, cunning, fatigue, and sometimes compassion as well. They were the true place where worlds touched, not on the map, but in the throat, in memory, in the way a sentence passes through one life and enters the other side with its meaning altered ever so slightly. And so, when this chapter closes, perhaps we may keep one very quiet image, not the fleet, not the cross, not a throne or banners, only a single person standing between two groups of people, turning to one side to listen, then to the other to speak. The wind passes through, everyone waits, and in those few brief seconds, the whole encounter seems to rest inside the body of a single human being. Perhaps that is the truest way to remember them, not as passing shadows moving through history, but as the place through which history itself had to pass in order to continue. It is only a sorrow that each time history passed through, it so often left upon those people a division that never fully closed again. Perhaps in the first many months of that journey, even after they had already set foot on new shores, many Europeans still did not truly understand what they were entering. They could see villages, see people, see fields, canoes, rituals, gifts, unfamiliar faces. But somewhere deep within their imagination, America was still held in place as a vast outer edge of land, a distant region that might be rich, might be dangerous, might be strange, yet had not been fully seen as a crowded, organized world with centers of power, great cities, and a refined rhythm of life equal to any order Europe had ever known. Then they entered central Mexico, and that vision began to break apart. If we move very slowly into this chapter, we should begin not with the city itself, but with the feeling before the city appeared. Cortez's men were not advancing into an empty space. They were moving into an interior already bound together by roads, by exchange, by news, by unease, by rumors that had gone ahead of their footsteps. The Library of Congress states clearly that in 1519, Cortez set out with 11 ships and about 500 men, driven by rumors of gold and of great, sophisticated cities deep in the interior of Mexico. That detail alone says a great deal, even before seeing Tenochtitlan with their own eyes. Europeans had already begun to hear that within this continent there were not only scattered coastlines, but centers of power large enough to become objects of ambition. Imagine that company moving through higher lands, the climate gradually changing, the air thinning, and the world before them opening in a way the sea never could. The sea always conceals with the horizon. The interior, once it begins to unfold, reveals itself through depth. There may have been mornings when they passed through mist along mountain slopes, along roads others had walked for a very long time before them, past stopping places, through regions that did not feel at all like the margins of the world. Every step inward quietly revised part of the way they thought about this land. America did not have only shores. It had a core, it had a center, and anyone who wished to go deeper had to enter a place that already had owners, laws, and networks of its own. That realization did not explode into full awareness in a single instant. It grew. But in the end, it came face to face with a form that could not be denied. Tenochtitlan appeared to Europeans as a shock of recognition, not merely because it was vast or wealthy, but because it forced them to reconsider all their assumptions. The Library of Congress writes that by the time Cortez arrived, the Mexica Empire dominated much of Mesoamerica, and the capital, Tenochtitlan, had become so magnificent that, according to the records, it astonished the Spaniards beyond anything they had ever seen before. Britannica, meanwhile, notes that Tenochtitlan was founded around 1325 on small islands in Lake Texcoco, then gradually expanded through artificial islands, linked to the mainland by raised causeways. If we try to enter that scene through the slow imagination of a bedtime story, we do not see a dry stone city like many European urban centers, but a city floating within water, a city embraced by the lake around it, with roads like strips of land stretching through the surface of the water, with houses, plazas, temples, with the movement of people and goods, with the rhythm of a center long accustomed to being served, revered, and approached from many different regions. This was not a landing ground. This was not a large village. This was a capital, and that simple truth alone forced many old European imaginings to step back. The map printed with Cortez's letter, described by the Library of Congress as the first European printed image of Tenochtitlan, shows a large and complex city with the main temple precinct and plaza, houses, major roads, raised causeways, lakes, outlying districts, and towns along the shore. The map is also said to have drawn from both European and indigenous sources. The fact that a European had to send back to his emperor an image like this was itself deeply symbolic. A land once imagined as distant, vague, and easily reduced to a few broad words now had to appear as a structure that could be drawn, described, and presented in such a way that those across the ocean would understand that a true urban order existed here. And then there was the water. That matters greatly. For Tenochtitlan was not only large, it was different. The National Museum of the American Indian notes that the area now known as Mexico City was once covered with canals and artificial islands on the shallow lake bed of the Valley of Mexico. The Chinampas, a kind of amphibious agricultural landscape developed by the Aztecs of Tenochtitlan, made it possible to cultivate several harvests a year. In other words, this was not simply a beautiful city to behold, it was a city sustained by very high levels of technique, organization, and ecological knowledge. Europeans were not seeing only houses and temples. They were seeing a system that knew how to turn water into infrastructure, transform the lake into a source of life, and make landscape itself part of political strength. Perhaps that is what should be held longest in this chapter. The astonishment did not come only from beauty, it came from capability. From the moment Europeans realized that they were not standing before a pristine world waiting to be formed, but before a society already formed deeply and firmly, one that had accomplished great things according to a logic different from their own. The causeways linking the city to the mainland, the expanses of water, the ceremonial districts, the dwellings, the public spaces, all of it spoke the same truth. This was a world built not by accident, but through power, labor, skill, and collective memory over many generations. And at the center of that world was Moctezuma. In his second letter, Cortés recounted his first meeting with Moctezuma II and described the greatness and wealth of his empire. The Library of Congress also notes that it was in this edition, together with the letter, that Europeans first saw a printed plan of Tenochtitlan. That makes the meeting between Cortés and Moctezuma more than a meeting between two individuals. It is the moment Europe began to tell itself a different story about America, not merely one of strange shores and scattered encounters, but of an empire with a capital, with ceremony, with a court, with hierarchy, with a grandeur capable of stepping directly into the European imagination and remaining there. We can imagine that meeting as a scene that is very still, yet very heavy. Power does not need to shout to be visible. Sometimes it is enough to see the way one person steps into the road, the way others walk beside him, the way fabric falls from their bodies, the way space yields a proper distance around them, the way those nearby lower themselves just enough. When Cortés entered Tenochtitlan, he did not step into an undefined space. He stepped into ritual, and that ritual, like the city itself, told him that he was standing before an order far older than the ambition that had only just arrived. This is a very subtle point in Chapter 6. We do not necessarily need to tell it like a textbook scene of Europeans amazed by indigenous civilization. A stronger way to tell it is this: they were forced to revise their scale of judgment. Before that, they may have thought that the most valuable things in the new land were gold, spices, roots, the possibility of extending fame and power. but standing before Tenochtitlan. They also had to confront another kind of value, the truth that the world on this side of the ocean had built centers so great that even those who came in a spirit of conquest were compelled to look again, to record, to draw, to send word home, to admit through their own astonishment that this place was not empty at all. We may stand at the edge of that city a little longer, try to hear its sounds in the imagination, the touch of water against retaining walls, the stroke of paddles, footsteps on the raised roads, human voices from markets, courtyards, ceremonial precincts, the smell of lake mud, the scent of fresh vegetation from the chinampas, a thin thread of cooking smoke, light reflected from the water onto walls, onto stone, onto fabric, for people who had lived in the urban world of Europe. There must have been a feeling both familiar and unfamiliar, familiar, because this was an organized urban center, unfamiliar, because it functioned through water, through lake, through islands, in a form they had never learned how to see before. This chapter should also preserve a beautiful and sorrowful paradox. Those who came here with the intention of expanding their own power were also the ones who carried back to Europe the clearest proof that America was not a blank space. Through his letters and maps, Cortés helped bring before Europe an image of a great city and a powerful empire. In other words, his ambition did not merely open the way for upheaval, it also, unintentionally, shattered an older illusion. After Tenochtitlan, Europe could no longer easily tell itself that the lands to the west were only dim outer shores waiting to be defined. Of course, we know what came after. The Library of Congress writes that only 2 years after Cortés and his company arrived, prolonged war together with diseases new to the Americas destroyed Tenochtitlan, and the Aztec Empire was no more. But that belongs to the rhythm of what follows, to another movement, darker and heavier. In this chapter, we stop at the moment of recognition, the moment before admiration, ambition, calculation, and fear become so thoroughly entangled that they cannot be separated. The moment when Europeans had to stand before a city and understand that they were not merely passing through a new land, but looking upon one of the great centers of a world that had long already existed in fullness. There are turning points in history that do not begin with a great sound. They do not appear like a door slamming shut, or a command ringing out across a square. Sometimes, they begin with things far quieter and far more human. A store of food slowly thinning, a dry season stretching longer than usual, a group of people looking across the river at one another with the feeling that they still need each other, and yet no longer trust each other as before. If the earlier chapters told of first glances, first gifts, and the fragile bridges of language and ritual, then this chapter is the moment when that bridge begins to crack. Not because one side suddenly changes completely in a single day, but because hunger, weariness, worry, and mismatched expectations have been gathering in silence for long enough to make everything different. When the English arrived at Jamestown in 1607, they did not step into a place that was easy to live in. The National Park Service records that not long after Newport's ship departed, many of the settlers fell ill because the river water was salty or brackish, and because of harsh living conditions and an unstable food supply. That same NPS source also emphasizes that without the early assistance of Powhatan and the surrounding indigenous communities, the settlement might very well not have survived its first years. Try to picture Jamestown in those first months as a place that had barely been built and already seemed exhausted. The damp air of the marsh country crept into wood, into blankets and clothing, into human bones. The river might look calm from a distance, but its water was not the kind that could easily sustain a community still fumbling with the land, the climate, the seasons, and with the consequences of its own poor decisions. The English had arrived carrying many dreams of quick wealth, and the Library of Congress notes that in their search for instant riches, they neglected the planting of corn and the practical work necessary to make the colony stand on its own feet. As a result, they became more and more dependent on food from indigenous communities. For a short time, that dependence could still be covered by ritual and goodwill. Powhatan, according to the Library of Congress, initially hoped he might absorb the newcomers through hospitality and through repeated gifts of food. The National Park Service also records that after those first contacts with John Smith, Powhatan sent food and furs to the English when they were in need, and that Pocahontas sometimes accompanied those groups as a sign of peace. In the light of those days, history still seemed capable of turning toward a less Tajeli direction. One side needed the other, and that mutual need had not yet fully hardened into a struggle. If we move slowly through those images, we begin to feel a very fragile rhythm. From Jamestown, weary men looked out toward the riverbank, waiting for canoes carrying maize to arrive. From Powhatan's side, the giving of food was not simply an act of unconditional generosity. It was also a way of placing strangers within a structure of relationships he understood very well. Whoever accepted that nourishment also entered a network of obligation, respect, and relative standing within the Chesapeake world. The problem was that the English did not truly enter that network with the same understanding. They received food as something necessary for survival, but did not necessarily accept that receiving it also meant placing limits upon their own ambitions. That slight difference in understanding, over time, became enormous. Then the weather changed. The National Park Service states that by the winter of 1608 to 1609, a severe drought had greatly reduced the harvests of Powhatan communities. In that context, the English demand for even more food caused tensions to rise. NPS explains very clearly that Powhatan's official policy at that time became to stop trading with the English, because the settlers were asking for more than his people could spare. NPS also notes that when they failed to obtain what they wanted through negotiation, the English began using increasingly harsher methods with nearby communities in order to secure more food. Here, the turning point of Chapter 7 becomes clearest. Though it does not need to be told in overly heavy language, one need only imagine the two banks of a river looking at one another during a dry season. On one side are indigenous communities now forced to calculate more carefully each basket of maize, each storehouse, each coming season. On the other side is Jamestown, where people from a faraway world have still not learned how to live in accordance with this land, this climate, this rhythm of seasons. Both sides know that food is not merely food. It is time. It is the future of children. It is the possibility of surviving into the next season. And when something so essential is pulled between two different systems of value, caution can hardly help but grow. The National Park Service describes the winter of 1609 to 1610 as the period later known as the starving time. According to NPS, by the end of 1609, relations between Powhatan and the English had broken down because the English were demanding too much food during a prolonged drought. And during that winter, they did not dare leave the fort for fear of encounters outside its walls. NPS also records that by early 1610, most of the settlers inside the fort had not survived that winter. William Strachey's estimate, cited by NPS, suggests that around 80 to 90% died from hunger and disease. But rather than seeing the starving time as a dry historical label, try to see it as a winter that stretched for a very long time inside the human mind. Waking in the morning without knowing whether there will be anything left to eat that day. Wind slipping through thin wooden walls. Storehouses growing emptier and emptier. Conversations becoming shorter. Eyes growing more alert to every small sign. Whether a canoe has appeared on the river, whether a sentry has seen movement near the forest's edge, who is weakening, who still has strength to go out, who is beginning to lose faith in tomorrow. This was not only material deprivation, it was also the erosion of the spirit. And once human beings have been worn down for long enough, the way they look at the people on the other side begins to change as well. The saddest thing in this chapter is that both sides had their own reasons to be afraid from inside Jamestown. The English looked outward with the feeling of being trapped in a land they did not truly understand, dependent upon communities that were no longer willing to help as before. From Powhatan's side, fear took on a different shape, the worry that these strangers would not stop at merely asking for food, that they would continue demanding, continue expanding, continue treating land and people as though everything could be drawn into their own needs. One side feared being left to starve, the other feared being pushed aside. Those two fears were not the same, but set beside one another. They produced the same result. Trust was gone. We should also remember that before everything finally gave way, there had once been other images. Pocahontas, in her youth, accompanied groups carrying food to Jamestown. NPS says the English saw her as a sign of peace in another world. Perhaps such journeys might have become the foundation for a relationship that was more durable, slower, and less driven by ambition. But history did not follow that road. NPS states that when relations between the two sides worsened, Powhatan moved his center of power farther inland in 1609, and Pocahontas was no longer allowed to visit Jamestown. That detail alone is like a door closing very softly, yet very decisively. A bridge that once existed, however fragile, could no longer be crossed as it had been before. The Library of Congress writes that John Smith helped the colony maintain a certain degree of stability during its first 2 years by exploring the region and establishing trade with indigenous peoples. Yet, at the same time, that source also points out that Smith carried a hard view. He believed the English should compel indigenous people to labor for them. That means that even during the period when exchange was still taking place, beneath the surface there had always been a deep difference in how the two sides imagined this relationship. One side may have thought in terms of balance and position within a communal network. The other had already begun, quietly, to imagine living upon the labor of others. When ideas like these met a drought, an emptying food supply, and a weakening settlement, a fracture was almost inevitable, perhaps for that reason. Chapter 7 should not be told as a story in which one side suddenly changed its heart. It is the story of many layers of exhaustion settling one upon another. Jamestown had not prepared enough for itself. Powhatan could not continue feeding a foreign community that demanded more and more, while his own people also had to think of their limited harvests. Encounters that had once been able to retain a certain courtesy were now covered over by urgency. When people are hungry and afraid, they no longer hear in the same way. A refusal begins to sting more sharply. A request begins to sound heavier. A trading journey can begin to feel like a test of strength. And once that happens often enough, history changes its voice. NPS also records that during that winter. The people inside the fort were almost cut off from the world around them, living with constant dread whenever they went outside. By May 1610, when survivors from Bermuda arrived, they found Jamestown in a shattered state, its fences damaged and its food supplies very low. A decision had even been made to abandon the settlement, before a relief fleet appeared and caused them to turn back. This detail matters greatly, because it shows that Jamestown had in fact reached the edge of collapse. The colony the English had once thought would quickly open the way to a wealthy future had, at one point, become little more than a place clinging to a fragile presence. If tonight we tell the final movement of this chapter very slowly, we may see two worlds drifting apart, not on the map, but in feeling, from one riverbank. The English look across with weariness and unease growing heavier by the day. From the other, the Powhatan world looks back with a conclusion also becoming clearer and clearer. These people will not confine themselves to the place that was meant for them. The National Park Service records that Powhatan ultimately came to want the English to leave his country. And from the English side, the early dependence did not grow into lasting gratitude, but instead gradually gave way to harder responses toward the surrounding communities. That was the moment when hunger, anxiety, and differences of intention no longer remained still beneath the water. And so, the turning point of Chapter 7 is not merely a matter of scarcity. It is the moment when both sides understand that they are no longer participating in the same story. For Powhatan, the question is no longer whether these strangers can continue to be placed within his network of relationships. For the English, it is no longer simply a matter of waiting for food to come again from across the river. From that point onward, each side begins to look at the other through the lens of a fully ripened fear. And once that happens, every gesture grows heavier. A canoe on the water, a shadow at the forest edge, a trading expedition, a gate closing at dusk. None of these things remain innocent any longer. After all the sails that had risen upon the horizon, after the gifts, the greetings, and the encounters that were at times as gentle as early light, and at times as heavy as the sky before a storm, perhaps the greatest remaining question is not merely how Europeans came to the Americas. The deeper question is this: how did indigenous peoples answer? Because if we tell this story only as a sequence of journeys from across the ocean, we will miss what matters most. Indigenous communities were not merely the ones who were seen, named, or swept into upheaval. They were also the ones who looked back, who weighed what they saw, who negotiated, who tried to keep their distance, who opened their doors when they believed it necessary, who closed them when they could no longer continue, who sought ways to bend the wave that was coming toward them, and who, when needed, rose to say something very clear through their actions. We are still here, and we are not an empty space in someone else's story. Perhaps that is why this final chapter should be told as a band of answers, rather than a single answer. The Americas were too vast, too varied, and indigenous communities too diverse to respond in only one way, in one place. The answer was to open a relationship of exchange while still keeping the initiative. In another, it was to hold fast to systems of waterways, shoals, mud flats, and canoe routes that only they fully understood. In yet another region, it was to preserve memory long enough that one day they could force outsiders to leave, and in many places, the simplest and most enduring answer was also the one that seemed the smallest: to continue existing. Let us begin in the north, where the St. Lawrence River opens into the interior like a long ribbon of water carrying news, goods, and trial alike. Canada records that Jacques Cartier was the first European to explore the St. Lawrence River and to behold the regions that are now Quebec City and Montreal. But if we look at it through a slower narrative rhythm, the thing worth remembering is not simply that he entered there. What matters more is that the French later could not turn this region into a space of their own without passing through relationships with indigenous communities. Discover Canada states very clearly that the French and indigenous peoples cooperated in the vast fur trade economy, driven by Europe's demand for beaver pelts. That means that along the St. Lawrence and farther into the Great Lakes, the indigenous answer was not simply to resist or not resist. It was also to place the newcomers within networks of trade, movement, and alliance that no one could afford to ignore. If we imagine that scene on a misty morning along the river, we do not see one side standing in silence before the other. We see canoes moving across waters long familiar to indigenous peoples, landing places, bundles of goods, hands touching fur, metal objects, cloth, tobacco, and conversations that turn not only around barter, but around routes, seasons, arrivals, departures, whom one may trust and whom one should keep at a distance in worlds like these. The indigenous answer does not lie in a simple yes or no. It lies in the ability to remain indispensable. The French may have brought guns, ships, and imperial ambition with them, but they could not by themselves read an entire waterway, a hunting season, a route, or a web of relationships woven long before they arrived. Here, indigenous peoples answered not by withdrawing altogether, but by making their very presence something outsiders could not dismiss. Then farther south, Florida opens under fierce sunlight, through channels, river mouths, low islands, and waterways tangled like a net. There, the Calusa offered a different kind of answer. The National Park Service describes the Calusa as a powerful and complex society on the southwest coast of Florida. with the Caloosahatchee as a major waterway of their world. Everglades National Park also records that when Spaniards encountered the Calusa in the 16th century, they took note of monumental shellworks, refined ceremonial art, and a complex political system. That source also emphasizes that before the Spanish arrived in 1513, southern Florida lay largely within the living world of the Calusa, a highly organized society with long canoe routes and striking physical traces still remaining. If we tell the story of the Calusa in the rhythm of a late night, we see that their answer did not begin with words. It began with mastery of the landscape. The waterways outsiders saw as tangled. They understood the veins of their homeland, the mudflats, estuaries, and low coastal islands that newcomers might have found fragile were, for them, places to travel, to anchor, to shelter, to observe, and to live. There are forms of power that do not need great stone walls or towering fortresses to prove themselves. They need only to exist firmly enough within the body of a place. The Calusa were a form of power like that. Europeans might arrive in great ships, but once they entered that watery world, they were no longer the ones who understood the ground beneath their feet. And that, in itself, was already an answer. We are not easily turned into the outskirts of your world, because you do not yet understand this place. Of course, history does not always grant such answers a fair ending. Both NPS and Everglades record that by the 18th century, the Calusa had been greatly reduced by diseases that came with European settlers. But even in the face of upheavals so immense and so unjust, what remains in historical memory is the truth that they were never a passive people waiting to be named. They were a coastal power that even outsiders had to acknowledge. And sometimes, in the history of first encounters, simply forcing those who arrive later to recognize that they are facing a real order of life is already a form of reply. But perhaps the place where the indigenous answer resounds most clearly is the Southwest, among mesas, dry valleys, pueblo villages of adobe, and a sky so wide that all movement seems to grow smaller beneath it. The National Park Service records that when Spaniards began arriving in New Mexico in 1540, they encountered a thriving pueblo culture, rich in tradition and held together by trade as well as family ties. NPS also states that in 1680, the Pueblo Revolt forced Europeans out of New Mexico until 1692, when the Spanish returned and reoccupied the middle Rio Grande. Another NPS article emphasizes that nearly 20 pueblos rose together in a coordinated resistance, marking a forceful period of reclaiming autonomy in New Mexico. Here, if we move very slowly, we begin to see the strangest and perhaps deepest truth of this final chapter. The indigenous answer was not merely a passing reaction. It was memory held long enough to become collective action. Years of pressure, of being told they must live within another order, of being drawn away from the spiritual and material rhythm of their own world, finally reached a point at which Pueblo communities did more than endure. They organized. They waited for the right moment. They compelled those who believed they had taken root there to leave for many years. We do not need to tell that scene in a heavy voice to feel its force. It is the moment when a world long pushed back speaks back in a language no one can pretend not to hear. And then, after everything, Perhaps the deepest answer lies not in trade, nor in holding ground, nor only in organized resistance. Perhaps the deepest answer lies in the survival of memory and identity. The Smithsonian writes that descendants of the Taino still live today throughout the Greater Antilles and surrounding regions. Many Caribbean people of indigenous ancestry continue to identify as Taino. Another exhibition from the National Museum of the American Indian also emphasizes the revival of Taino cultural identity among descendant communities in Puerto Rico and Cuba. That means that even in places where history once moved too quickly to declare that a people had disappeared, the true indigenous answer has been this: we are still here, in our names, in ceremony, in family memory, in cassava bread, in canoes, in the way we tell of our ancestors, and in the choice to speak our name once again. I think this is the most important point on which to close the entire journey. Because if we are not careful, a story about first encounters can too easily drift toward an overly simple conclusion, as though everything were only a one-way current flowing from Europe into the Americas. But real history is not so flat. It is full of bends, shoals, and places where the current seems destined to continue in one direction until the land itself forces it elsewhere. Indigenous peoples did not answer in the same way everywhere, nor could they. Each community had its own landscape, its own memory, its own wounds, its own opportunities, and its own limits. In one place, the answer was a calculated alliance. In another, it was holding the advantage of geography and waterways. In another still, it was waiting, then pushing back together against the pressure. Elsewhere, it was preserving a name across centuries, only to speak it again in the modern world. But all of these answers meet at one point. They affirm that indigenous peoples were not merely the objects of history, but the subjects of history. If tonight we want to keep one final image for Chapter 8, it may not be only one place. It may be many places layered over one another, like strata of memory across a single continent. A canoe on the St. Lawrence, moving through morning mist beside bundles of fur. A waterway in Florida, where the Calusa know every bend more intimately than any foreign sailor. A pueblo standing still beneath the wide sky, where memory is strong enough to become collective action. And far to the southeast, on a Caribbean island, a family still keeping an old ancestral name, as though protecting a flame from going out. These images do not resemble one another, yet all of them say the same thing, gently but enduringly. The indigenous answer was never only silence. And so, as this long journey comes to a close, perhaps what remains most deeply is not merely the feeling of ships having arrived. It is also the feeling of the people who were already here, who saw those ships, who endured consequences far too great because of them, and yet also left their own answers upon the current of history. Some answers were spoken through exchange, some through distance, some through coordination, some through the continuation of descendants, taken together. They remind us that the history of the Americas is not only the story of Europe's arrival, it is also the story of indigenous worlds that negotiated, endured, reshaped themselves in order to continue, and in doing so, refused to let themselves be sealed away as a minor chapter in someone else's dream. And now, as those strange sails on the horizon, the beaches of that first encounter, the hands extended in caution, the gifts exchanged in silence, the cities that astonished outsiders, and even the lands that learned how to live with upheaval are all slowly receding behind us. Perhaps you have begun to feel that this story was never only about Europeans arriving in the Americas. Tonight, we have traveled across a continent that was already full of people, full of memory, full of roads, harvests, and its own inner worlds of spirit. We have stood at the edge of encounters that at first may have seemed no more than a brief moment of looking at one another through the sea wind, yet slowly became misunderstanding, negotiation, dependence, conflict, loss, and enduring resistance. And perhaps what lingers longest after this journey is not only the image of ships or battles, but the deeply human feeling that history can sometimes change direction from a single first glance. A brief moment when two worlds understood nothing about each other, and yet had already begun to change one another forever. If you are still here with me in these final moments, leave a small comment and tell me what story you would like to hear next. It could be a night devoted to the Taino before Columbus set foot in the Caribbean, to the city of Tenochtitlan before its fall, to the world of Powhatan before Jamestown had yet appeared, or to the quiet yet unyielding resistance of indigenous communities. And if you love these slow journeys through history, do not forget to subscribe to the channel and follow the fan page so we can continue into the stories still to come together. But for now, I wish you a night that is truly peaceful, truly deep, and may history slowly dissolve into sleep like the sound of distant waves beyond the dark shore.